My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again.
Oh boy. All right. Welcome to the Tariffs show. It is Liberation Day on the day that I'm recording this, April 2nd. I'm going to have a guest join me here in a little bit. His name is Aiden Grogan. He's a writer and a Ph.D. student at Liberty University. He works at several free market think tanks, including the Illinois Policy Institute and the American Institute for Economic Research, and Young Voices contributor. And we're going to talk about whether or not tariffs will bring on the golden age. But I want to, before we talk to him, give my opinion. First and foremost, I think if you've listened to this show for a long time, you understand I cannot stand politicians. First, we'll just stop there, right? Just stop there. It's not even like, I know I get dinged with TDS and I'm anti-Trump, but that's just because he's a politician, right? Like, I got equally as annoyed today when I saw yesterday there's this big election in Wisconsin where there was $100 million spent on a Supreme Court justice race between a Democrat and a Republican. $100 million on one Supreme Court race. That's bonkers. And $20 million of that was spent by Elon Musk on behalf of the Republican judge. Why? Well, Wisconsin has a law that a car manufacturer cannot own a dealership in Wisconsin. And so he has to go through third-party brokers. And I think that's crazy. I agree with Elon Musk that that's crazy. And he's got a pending court case that will probably end up in the Supreme Court that will allow him to sell cars in Wisconsin. And he's saying Western civilization begins and ends with whether or not this Supreme Court justice was won by a Republican or a Democrat. So, of course, everybody's trolling him today saying, I guess Western civilization is over, right? First of all, this is what I'm talking about. This is a ridiculous claim. And like, in spirit, the Doge project, I'm Team Vivek on this. Like, if you watch him talk to Andrew, the podcast guy, Andrew Schultz. And by the way, the kid that has the long hair, the young guy, Nick, I think his name's Nick. He was my intern at Bob and Tom. Really interesting, smart guy. But Andrew Schultz had Vivek on, and go watch that because you kind of see Vivek. Well, yeah, I wanted to do it the right way. And because I wanted to do it the right way, I got kicked out. Whatever you think of Doge, good or bad, okay? You can't argue that Elon Musk has fudged a lot of these numbers and says a lot of things that just are not true. It's a lot like Donald Trump, okay? But Tim Walz, the Democrat, and this is why I really reserve the scorn more for Democrats a lot of times, because you constantly are telling us how you're better than Republicans. You're just morally superior to Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And so Tim Walz posted today, we beat the billionaire. Okay, but you're leaving out that George Soros and J.D. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, okay, there was $100 million in that race and 20 of it was Elon Musk. Where'd the other 80 million come from? Your billionaires. And other of their billionaires. It's billionaires. It just drives me crazy. I just hate when people try to manipulate. This is, I think, what really, as somebody who works in the media, I take very seriously what I say. I realized kind of early into We're Libertarians back in the mid-2010s, what I say into this microphone, people are taking me seriously. I better actually read some stuff and do some research, and I kind of went overboard with it in 2017-ish, but I really take it responsibly. It's a responsibility to build a crowd and to talk to that crowd and to say accurate things to the best of your ability. You will not always get everything right. I will call him Mike McCarthy sometimes instead of Kevin, but Nobody's perfect. Nobody's expecting everybody to be perfect, but they do expect that you do have their best interest at heart when you're talking to them. And politicians don't generally care about that. They care about political power. It's about power. Power, as Dan Bongino said. So, and this is why I hate the term Liberation Day. You're raising taxes roughly $3,600 to $4,200 on the average American family a year. Okay, you're not raising taxes, but a tariff is a tax. The government is imposing itself on the marketplace and making you pay more for goods that you want. And Trump will argue, well, you don't have to pay any tariff tax if you make your products in America. Okay, well, that's completely bonkers for the world that we live in and the way that we have structured our economy. And investment is coming back to America in certain ways, but like he's taking credit for Eli Lilly. He's taking credit for another car plant being built. I think Honda is increasing the amount of cars made here in some form or fashion. Like that isn't a result of 2 months of presidential bluster on Truth Social. Like major global corporations like Lilly and Honda make decisions years in advance before they're announced. Now they, like Lilly, may fly a giant American flag behind them to take advantage of the moment, but we really have to look at like why is made in California on Apple products now? Why is Lilly and Honda coming back to America? It isn't a result of tariff policy that was enacted like today, or it is the fact that China is completely economically unstable. India, in some respects, is economically unstable. It's also immoral in a lot of ways to work like these Foxconn. You want to talk about how bad Amazon warehouses are? Look at Foxconn warehouses that make Apple products. And Apple, after years and years of being shamed rightfully for the immoral conditions, the basically slavery that was going into their products in China, started to push them. And then the turn towards greater authoritarianism and the instability and lack of safety of operating as Americans in China started to turn that around too. You know, government confiscation of things like Jack Ma's company. So the reason is not tariffs. The reason is economic instability and a predatory government. That's why these companies are starting to reshore. And I think COVID was another wake-up call. We're making all of these drugs in China and India. Okay, what if there's a global pandemic? We need to think about our people and our bottom line, and we need to be in America. And maybe we have gone too far in globalization and rotting out rural America. But for America to follow that instability and predatory nature and then call it Liberation Day and think that that is somehow going to make American companies feel better about locating here, that's bonkers. Calling a tax increase of $4,200 on American families Liberation Day is Orwellian. It's crazy to me. So Trump just spoke, and he is declaring a declaration of economic independence, and he's imposing a universal baseline tariff of 10% and additional rates that apply to certain countries. Some of the rates he announced: 34% for China, 26% for India, 24% for Japan, were much higher than what some economists and policymakers had been expecting. So Scott Linscomb and Colin Grabow, this is on the New York Times website right here, trade experts at the Cato Institute, which promotes free markets. I love that when a Republican is in the White House, now all of a sudden the New York Times is quoting the Cato Institute, but we'll take it. They offer, Scott Linscomb, his Twitter's a must. You must follow it. Linscomb. offer some historical perspective on the new tariffs and argue that the justifications for them are flimsy and conflicting. With today's announcement, U.S. tariffs will approach levels not seen since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which incited a global trade war and deepened the Great Depression. Not good. So, David Bonson, and Trump is totally betraying what got him elected president. Trump was elected president to make groceries cheaper. Trump was elected president to make our life more affordable because the pandemic had made it more expensive. And I literally saw a very smart person who was a liberal on Twitter yesterday saying, Biden's stimulus spending just really ramped up inflation. And so I'll give you that. It's like, that stimulus, all three bills were written by Donald Trump. And you can Google this. Donald Trump was mad at Nancy Pelosi because the stimulus wasn't big enough. Like, if you needed evidence that this guy makes the economy worse, all you need to do is look at the end of his first term when he was making the decisions. All the stuff that you liked was because of Mitch McConnell. The tax cuts were because of Mitch McConnell. The lowering of the capital gains tax, that was Mitch McConnell and the Republican senators and the adults that were around Donald Trump. So once he was in charge and he was in actually making the decisions by 2020, things got bad. And you don't remember that because they're really good at propaganda, like calling this Liberation Day. It's lying to the American public, and it makes me so angry. So where are we at on tariffs generally? So the New York Times again had an article. Data from the World Trade Organization showed the United States had a trade-weighted average tariff rate of 2.2% in 2023, compared with 2.7% for the European Union, 1.9% in Japan, 3.4% for Canada, 3% for China, and 1.7% for Switzerland. Some poorer countries do have higher rates. India's trade-weighted average tariff rate is 12%, and Mexico's is 3.9%. Vietnam's 5.1%. U.S. tariff rates are somewhat. This is Ed Gresser, who works at the Progressive Policy Institute. U.S. tariff rates are somewhat lower than tariff rates in other countries, but vis-a-vis other rich countries, it's not a lot. Tariff for specific products vary widely. The United States levies individual tariff rates on about 13,000 foreign products, according to Doug Irwin, a trade historian. And the U.S. trades with almost 200 countries, each of which have set their own rates for different products. David Bonson is a guy that I like. Stephen Moore is a guy that I like. Stephen Moore tweeted out yesterday saying, "Don't panic. Despite the recent losses due to tariff fears and economic slowdown, history shows that Trumponomics drives growth." Let me put this up for the video viewers so you can see the tweet. But Stephen Moore, Trump Economic Miracle, that's his book, right? Heritage Fellow, Wall Street Journal writer, Club for Growth founder, really good on economics, but going kind of Looney Tunes. Like, it's like putting astrologers in charge of NASA right now. But David Bonson is a guy that I really like, writes for National Review, always on my favorite news podcast, which is The World and Everything in It by World News Group. Bonson says in response to this, Steve is right. There were pro-growth policies in 2017 that trumped the tiny miniature tariffs of 2018. The two things different this time at this point are pro-growth policies are not yet there on the tax side. They may come, they may not. They may come, but be much less stimulative to the supply side than they were in 2017. Those tax cuts are supposed to expire. But so far, the market can't assume that level of supply side pro-growth tax cuts are coming. And B, the 2025 tariff threats are equally roughly 9 times larger than the 2018 tariffs, many of which never even happened and were sliced to death with exceptions, exemptions, and waivers. $30 billion of tax increases versus $280 billion are on the table now, and it's apples to refrigerators levels different. So, that number of $30 billion of tax increases in 2018 versus $280 billion. Man, that's pretty significant. And you're going to pay the cost. And then the head of his, was it the Treasury Secretary, saying, you know, the American dream is not cheaper goods. And no, that's right. But you're trying to prime me for paying more to be patriotic, like higher prices are patriotic. So while we wait for our guest to join the conversation, I'm going to, you need some Reaganomics. Now, listen, you're going to love Aiden, but I think we're in a moment where we need a pro. All right. And Aiden is very good. I'm marginal. I think what we need is a little Reagan, a little Ronald Reagan, not my wife Reagan, who was named after Ronald Reagan. Believe it or not, that's how Republican her parents were. They're still pretty Republican. They had their Ron Paul moment, but Ronald Reagan gave these radio addresses starting back before he was president. So let me give you a little Reagan history here. Okay. Reagan, after he was governor, did these radio addresses. There's a great audiobook, a collection of them that you can find on Audible. But he loved doing the radio address every week, and they're just two legal pages handwritten of solid libertarianism in a lot of ways. But Reagan continued to give radio addresses like most presidents. Obama finally killed it and started doing web addresses. But the radio address he gave on 1988 was about tariffs. And you may have seen this on social media, but I'm going to play the whole thing because we need 5 minutes of Ronald Reagan. All right. So here you go.
My fellow Americans, this week as we prepared for Thanksgiving, Canada held an important election, and I'm pleased to again send my congratulations to Prime Minister Mulroney. One of the important issues in the Canadian election was trade, and like our own citizens earlier this month, our neighbors have sent a strong message rejecting protectionism and reaffirming that more trade, not less, is the wave of the future. Here in America, as we reflect on the many things we have to be grateful for, we should take a moment to recognize that one of the key factors behind our nation's great prosperity is the open trade policy that allows the American people to freely exchange goods and services with free people around the world. The freedom to trade is not a new issue for America. In 1776, our founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, charging the British with a number of offenses, among them, and I quote, cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, end quote. And that same year, a Scottish economist named Adam Smith launched another revolution with a book entitled The Wealth of Nations, which exposed for all time the folly of protectionism. Over the past 200 years, not only has the argument against tariffs and trade barriers won nearly universal agreement among economists, but it has also proven itself in the real world, where we have seen free trading nations prosper while protectionist countries fall behind. America's most recent experiment with protectionism was a disaster for the working men and women of this country. When Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, we were told that it would protect America from foreign competition and save jobs in this country. The same line we hear today. The actual result was the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in our history. 1 out of 4 Americans were thrown out of work. 2 years later, when I cast my first ballot for president, I voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who opposed protectionism and called for the repeal of that disastrous tariff. Ever since that time, the American people have stayed true to our heritage by rejecting the siren song of protectionism. In recent years, the trade deficit led some misguided politicians to call for protectionism, warning that otherwise we would lose jobs. But they were wrong again. In fact, the United States not only didn't lose jobs, we created more jobs than all the countries of Western Europe, Canada, and Japan combined. The record is clear that when America's total trade has increased, American jobs have also increased. And when our total trade has declined, so have the number of jobs. Part of the difficulty in accepting the good news about trade is in our words. We too often talk about trade while using the vocabulary of war. In war, for one side to win, the other must lose. But commerce is not warfare. Trade is an economic alliance that benefits both countries. There are no losers, only winners, and trade helps strengthen the free world. Yet today, protectionism is being used by some American politicians as a cheap form of nationalism, a fig leaf for those unwilling to maintain America's military strength and who lack the resolve to stand up to real enemies, countries that would use violence against us or our allies. Our peaceful trading partners are not our enemies. They are our allies. We should beware of the demagogues who are ready to declare a trade war against our friends, weakening our economy, our national security, and the entire free world, all while cynically waving the American flag. The expansion of the international economy is not a foreign invasion. It is an American triumph, one we worked hard to achieve, and something central to our vision of a peaceful and prosperous world of freedom. After the Second World War, America led the way to dismantle trade barriers and create a world trading system that set the stage for decades of unparalleled economic growth. And in 1 week, when important multilateral trade talks are held in Montreal, we will be in the forefront of efforts to improve this system. We want to open more markets for our products, to see to it that all nations play by the rules, and to seek improvement in such areas as dispute resolution and agriculture. We also want to bring the benefits of free trade to new areas, including services, investment, and the protection of intellectual property. Our negotiators will be working hard for all of us. Yes, back in 1776, our founding fathers believed that free trade was worth fighting for, and we can celebrate their victory, because today, trade is at the core of the alliance that secure the peace and guarantee our freedom. It is the source of our prosperity and the path to an even brighter future for America. Until next week, thanks for listening, and God bless you.
Hell yeah, Ronnie. Get him. I guess I would just end before we get to the interview with this. My co-host on the Pat Down, Dion, just always, we were having a conversation because I was like, look, it was after the Super Bowl halftime show thing. I'm like, I don't think these people that I'm friends with are racist. And yet every time there's anything that is non-white, they're against it. But I don't think that they're racist. And he's like, but look at the evidence. What does the evidence tell you? Is what Dion said to me. And that has kind of been ringing in my ears for so long. What does the evidence tell you? And I think it's a great way to cut through the nonsense. What does the evidence tell you about American life? Okay, we are the most successful country economically in the history of the world. And we did it, well, the Romans did it through slavery, and Americans did it through slavery for a period of time. But economics and war eventually liberated. I mean, the moral right side won out on that eventually. But America's economic system has helped, open trade has helped feed the world. And yeah, and our guest today kind of starts to fight the notion that globalization punishes rural communities. And I think it's a really interesting argument. So stay tuned for that. But what does the evidence tell you? Smoot-Hawley goes into place and there's a Great Depression. Okay, well, that's one piece of evidence. America has had less tariffs on its trading partners than other countries. We are more successful than those people. India has had more tariffs than other countries on its country. What does the evidence tell you? They're poorer than Americans. So what does the evidence tell you is something that I would just say, ask yourself that. What does the evidence tell me? Like, I can't tell if Donald Trump's racist or not. What does the evidence tell you? Who does he cater to? What does he say? can't tell if Donald Trump's right or wrong about this. What does the evidence tell you? The people who are for his belief in tariffs, there's like 14 of them in the country that think this is a good idea. And then there's a bunch of politically interested people who tell him that, oh, I agree with you, sir. Thank you. Can I have a job now? What does the evidence tell you? So our next guest is great at presenting evidence and giving a perspective. You can see why he's a doctoral candidate. Sharp mind. Love his sense of style. Great head of hair. So make sure you check this out on YouTube. I think you'll appreciate it. All right, thanks. We'll see you soon here on the Chris Spangle Show. We'll be right back with my interview with Aiden. All right, Aiden, thanks so much for joining me here on the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right, happy Liberation Day. What do you think of that phrase?
Well, we're certainly not being liberated. We're going to have higher prices for businesses and consumers. So exactly what we're being liberated from, I do not know. So reciprocal tariffs is obviously in the news today. That's top of the headlines everywhere. And I think reciprocal tariffs can certainly have good motivations insofar as they try to make the world more free market by encouraging other countries to lower their tariff barriers or ideally eliminate their tariff barriers. But there's no guarantee that that's actually going to happen, and other countries might retaliate against us with even higher tariffs, in which case American consumers and businesses are really going to feel it. And in a time when Americans have struggled so much under inflation, the last thing we need is higher prices.
Yeah, so why do you think he's doing this? Given all of his promises to make the economy better, I mean, it's sort of like one of those hard and fast rules in American history, like tariffs have these. We can see sort of what happens. Does he just not think that that's the case? Like, where's the administration's head at right now?
Donald Trump is a true believer in protectionism. He says that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. So he actually does truly believe that we can make America wealthy again through tariffs.
All right. Yeah. So what actually happens when you place a 10% tariff across every good imported into the United States? What do you?
Well, the effect is going to be higher prices, and we also might see retaliation, which will further affect our economy, and it's also going to affect jobs. That's something that we don't often hear about. The argument in support of tariffs is that this will boost U.S. manufacturing employment, but we only have to look back to the first Trump administration to see what the actual outcome of those attempts were. In 2018, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, which may have saved about 1,000 jobs in steel production in the short term, but led to ultimately 75,000 job losses in other industries that rely on steel and aluminum as inputs to production because of the higher prices. Also, President Obama imposed tariffs on tires, which also led to a net loss of jobs, particularly in the tire retail sector.
Yeah, and a lot of this is being done under the guise of national security as well. The fentanyl crisis. There's like 3 or 4 different working theories that he pushes on why Canada. Professor Daniel Dresner noted, if everything is defined as national security, nothing is a priority. So how significant is the risk of abusing the national security narrative on this justification for tariffs? And how do we avoid that?
There's a huge risk. So free traders going all the way back to Adam Smith have recognized that national security is very important, and it is a legitimate exception to free trade. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith wrote that defense is of much more importance than opulence. But as you said, if everything is national security, then ultimately nothing is national security. And if you're going to have a tariff regime, particularly one that emphasizes national security, you incentivize a lot of firms and their lobbyists to push for tariffs that ostensibly will protect U.S. national security. So we've seen Senator Marco Rubio prior to becoming the Secretary of State, arguing that sugar is necessary for U.S. national security. Of course, he was a senator from Florida, where so much of our domestic sugar production is located. So you can see that confluence between lawmakers and certain industries who are trying to implement protectionist measures that will safeguard their own economic interests, often at the expense of the American people at large.
Yeah. So, man, I guess I want to ask about the political side of this, and you may not be that guy, but I've watched so many Republicans who have spent so many years quoting Ronald Reagan, like a Marco Rubio, who was like an original Tea Party guy, take a turn on this stuff. Like, is it spinelessness? Is it I think differently about it? I went to the rural America and I heard them. Like, what do you think of the motivation for a lot of these politicians is? How should we like kind of break this down and think about it?
Well, I think there is a pervasive narrative about free trade and globalization that is wrong. The narrative is that the U.S. manufacturing base has been gutted, outsourced, decimated, etc. But in reality, U.S. real manufacturing output has continued to grow while manufacturing employment has declined. And that was a consequence of productivity gains through automation, artificial intelligence, and information technology. Actually, only a small minority of the manufacturing jobs went overseas to countries like China, Japan, or down to Mexico. By imposing tariffs, we're actually making the situation worse because we're driving up prices and we're incentivizing more firms to automate more tasks and lay off more workers. So the whole fixation on the ostensible loss of U.S. manufacturing is based on a misconception. But if you repeat a lie often enough, eventually it becomes a truth. So many people are used to writing that the U.S. manufacturing base has been absolutely gutted, and they don't even cite any statistics to showcase that because it's become so much of a widely accepted narrative.
Yeah. So, all right, I can complain about all this all day, right? That's what we do as liberty loving people. But, you emphasize in your article over at Real Clear Markets titled Tariffs Won't Bring on the Golden Age of America, which you can read by clicking in the show notes there. The need for America to cultivate a friendlier business environment. So like outline some key steps. How do we achieve that specifically regarding trade and investment policies that benefit everybody?
Well, the ideal situation is to limit tariff barriers as much as possible, except when it's absolutely vital for national security. And there's a great need for national security experts and economists to come together and specifically outline what do we absolutely need for our national security. Perhaps we need computer chips, but maybe we don't need potato chips. We've all heard that the famous quote, computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? That's not a very intelligent statement to make. So we do need to prioritize our national security, but we also have to be wary of these firms trying to make absurd arguments for tariffs to just benefit their own industry under the guise of national security.
So let's go back to the idea of rural America. I mean, I'm in Indiana, and when I was executive director of the Libertarian Party in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that entire corridor straight up from Indianapolis to South Bend, in a state of 6 million people, lost 780,000 jobs. That's hard to argue that globalization didn't impact those people. So what do you think happened? I want to make sure I understand your argument, because this is something I am sensitive to. I do understand, in these small Indiana towns, like there has been some devastation and some transition. What do we do to help those areas and grow jobs and economic opportunity in all of Indiana, not just like the city?
Absolutely. So I'd like to first say that I'm from Chicago, and I attended Illinois State University, which is in the heart of Illinois' Rust Belt. So I've been to some of these Rust Belt towns firsthand. I've seen how economically depressed they are and the various social problems that are occurring in these towns. So it's an issue that I've been particularly attentive to. And I used to be a protectionist. I used to think that tariffs were a way to revitalize these communities and perhaps solve some of these social problems, until I realized that the argument is based on a lot of misconceptions and a lot of childish narratives that tariffs can revitalize Americans' devotion to traditional social norms surrounding family and so forth. But I think what needs to happen is we need to acknowledge that we live in a very dynamic economy, and that changes are to be expected. But what's important to note is that those communities in the Midwest, Rust Belt states, that were negatively impacted by globalization and lost jobs, that lost factories, if they were willing to embrace the dynamism, if they were willing to embrace free markets, an entrepreneurial spirit, they were able to adapt and overcome those challenges, including by accepting foreign investment. But those communities that relied heavily on unions, protectionism, government intervention, and welfare remained economically depressed. And there's a couple really good examples that you can point toward in the Midwest. Grand Rapids, Michigan was a manufacturing hub that was negatively impacted by free trade and globalization, but then they've been able to rebound. Compare that to Detroit and how that city is run. And no one wants to live in Detroit today. You have massive population decline there, but Grand Rapids is a bustling town. It's a great place for young people to live, to raise families. Another town is West Point, Georgia. That was absolutely devastated by manufacturing companies moving out, but they accepted foreign investment. And West Point, Georgia, is a globalization success story. That is a town that has been able to successfully adapt. So the solution is really to embrace an entrepreneurial spirit and to allow some of these communities to adapt instead of trying to rely on big government intervention to solve the problems, which doesn't work.
Yeah, I think Springfield, Ohio is another one of those stories where you have immigrants coming in the Haitian community and working for local companies that is starting to revitalize that town. But then you have the tensions and, they're eating the dogs. And I actually just had lunch with an AP reporter who covered that and was like, no, there were no dogs being eaten. And it's amazing how that story fell off. The dogs are perfectly safe now that Trump's, but that's a great example of thinking differently and finding different solutions for some of these small towns, because, okay, well, how do you fund a tax base? So let's get back to tariffs. What does a good trade policy look like? Because, in the opening, and you hear Trump talk about this, there's these trade imbalances, and Canada has had these huge tariffs on us on these products for a long time. And it's just what's the problem with Trump kind of countering with those tariffs? We're being taken advantage of, Aiden, by having a open trade policies without tariffs and without protectionism. We're losing. What do you make of that argument?
So the Trump administration has been really clever because it has pointed toward these examples of other countries having these outrageous tariffs against us on certain products. But they're not looking at this from a 30,000-foot view to recognize that if you look at the average tariff rates of all countries in the world, the United States ranks somewhere in the middle. It's not as if we're the idiotic country at the top that is resolutely committed to free trade as the rest of the world has super high tariffs against us. In fact, some of our major trading partners have lower average tariffs than the United States. One such example is Poland, which is a far more nationalist and collectivist country than than we are, but they have a lower average tariff rate because the Poles understand that free trade is extremely beneficial to them. Also, the countries with the highest average tariffs tend to be the most impoverished, tyrannical, and corrupt countries. So we have to look at this from a different perspective and not just concentrate on a few of these outrageous tariffs against the United States. And again, reciprocal tariffs may have good intentions, and only time will tell if reciprocal tariffs succeed in bringing down other countries' tariff rates against the United States, but it's going to lead to problems if these countries retaliate by implementing even higher tariffs.
So yesterday I aired an episode with Gabby Blanco, who is a defector from Cuba. She works for the Dissident Project. And at the end of our episode, she said tariffs are kind of good because why should we have open trade with Cuba, which is this murderous regime? And all we're doing is enriching the richest people in Cuba to continue to enslave her family. Are there places for tariffs like that? I found her argument to be somewhat persuasive. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you can always point toward individual examples and make a moral or emotional case for a certain policy. And sometimes you can analyze these on a case-by-case basis. But if you're going to go so far as to say tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, and that tariffs are going to bring about this golden age of America, or that tariffs are going to make young men so rich that they become more attractive to women, and that restores the sanctity of the American family, that's an absolutely ridiculous and childish argument. We need to start taking some of these issues a lot more seriously and not just have simple solutions to very complicated problems.
All right, so we elect you president, and you can't do any worse. So let's give it a shot. What do you do tomorrow in regards to tariffs?
Well, I would eliminate most tariffs, and I would bring together great advisors on national security and economics to come up with a list of materials and industries that are absolutely necessary for U.S. national security, particularly against the rising threat of China, and I would proceed accordingly.
All right. Well, final thought, the floor is yours. I'm sure there's something that I should have asked you that I just don't know to ask you, and I'd love to hear what that is. What's your message for those who are listening?
Well, one big issue I have focused on is the relationship between free trade and globalization and the breakdown of the family. Many on the new right who are inclined toward national conservatism or post-liberalism have argued that the free trade consensus of the post-war era, or particularly the so-called market fundamentalism of the last 40 years, has wreaked economic havoc on the United States, particularly on the heartland and working class, non-college educated Americans, diminishing their prospects for marriage and having children and so forth. Oftentimes they say that the spike in out-of-wedlock births is caused by the free trade consensus and the havoc that has inflicted on certain communities. But if you look at the decline in the marriage rate, which really began or really took off after the 1960s, you'll notice that there is an analogous trend across the developed world, from Japan and South Korea to Australia and the European Union. But Japan and South Korea have been beneficiaries of globalization. Those countries have become enormously prosperous thanks to globalization and the economic prosperity that it has brought them. But the marriage rate is declining everywhere across the developed world. And that's a consequence of vast social changes, changes in family structure, changes in the role of woman in society. So we can't blame that on globalization. Also, as for the spike in out-of-wedlock births, what changed in America after the 1960s cultural revolution was the abandonment of an old custom called the shotgun marriage. It used to be that if you got a woman pregnant, you were expected to marry her and marry her prior to her giving birth to that child. Now, it was called a shotgun wedding, not necessarily just because the wedding was done quickly, but also because there was sometimes a shotgun involved. The woman's brother or her father were saying, "You better marry my daughter or else." So an interesting paper written by the former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, as well as some other economists and scholars, found that the disappearance of the shotgun marriage custom is what explains a lot of the rise in out-of-wedlock births throughout the 1980s and 1990s. So we can't really attribute this to free trade or globalization. That argument sounds quite Marxist and materialistic because it's attributing social pathologies almost exclusively to economic conditions rather than to culture and social norms. So I think a lot of the new right is very inclined toward that type of thinking, and they think if we simply change economic policy to be more collectivist or nationalist, that we can solve some of these social problems. But it's a very naive and childish approach to the world. And again, we need to start taking some of these problems more seriously and revitalize American civil society, which can't be achieved through public policy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the reality is that the government can't solve a heart problem. Like it has to come from community-based solutions, people working voluntarily together on their local level to solve these problems. You take an issue like marriage dissolution, single-parent households. Poverty is a huge, huge precursor to many of those things. It's partly the cause, partly, of you're a victim of your economic situation. Like eliminating jobs that are accessible to people in those situations, making their groceries more expensive, puts more pressure on the family and causes more dissolution. It's sort of like you said, progressive in that it backfires once you start to look to the government to solve some of these cultural issues. It's backwards to me.
Absolutely. Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind, said that one of the chief principles of the conservative is prudence, which means we have to consider the broad effects of anything that we do in policy. We can't just consider its short-term effects. We also have to consider its long-term effects. So with tariffs, there's always unintended consequences. And oftentimes those unintended consequences cause a lot more damage than any short-term good they may bring about.
All right, Aiden, I like the cut of your jib. Where can I follow you? Where can I learn more about what you're writing?
You can follow me on X at Aiden Grogan. That's AIDANGROGAN. You could also visit the American Institute for Economic Research at AIER.org or thedailyeconomy.org, and I have several articles that are posted there.
All right, and you got great hair. If you're listening on audio, you're missing out. Check the clips on social media or on our YouTube channel. Aiden, it's like a pompadour almost.
What can I say? It's I don't know, very very 1950s look. I think we need to bring back the old genteel conservatism.
All right.
Well, we're looking a little sloppy out there these days.
Oh, believe me. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. My wife saw photos of libertarians the other day and said, "Oh my goodness, does anybody own a coat?" All right, Aiden, thanks so much for joining us here at the show.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for joining me. If you learned something, if something was thought-provoking, if you just want to convince one of those lib or NatCon friends that you've got, send them this episode. That's the best way to help a podcast grow, is to share it with your friends. So and thank you, listener, for joining me here on The Chris Spangle Show.